Hello everybody, and welcome to Theology 101. Today we are going to look at the book of Philippians. The book of Philippians is the 11th book of the New Testament. The New Testament has 5 sections: the Gospels, the Acts of the Apostles, the Pauline Epistles, the General Epistles, and the book of Revelation. The Gospels contain the life, ministry, teachings, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. The Acts of the Apostles give a historical account of the growth and spread of the Christian church. The Pauline Epistles are a collection of letters written by Paul to different churches during his time, while the General Epistles are letters written by other leaders such as Peter, John, and Jude to different churches. Finally, the book of Revelation gives a picture of how the story of the world will end, with Jesus returning to earth to restore and reign on it. The book of Philippians is a part of the Pauline Epistles section of the New Testament. Let me go over the historical context of this book. The book of Philippians is one of Paul's 4 prison letters, referring to letters he wrote while he was in prison. Of the 4 prison epistles, Paul likely wrote Philippians last, near the end of his Roman imprisonment in AD 61 or 62. Paul sent the other 3 prison epistles, namely Ephesians, Colossians, and Philemon, by Tychicus, as their destinations were near one another. However, the letter to the Philippians was to be delivered by Epaphroditus, who had come to Paul in Rome with financial help from the church at Philippi. But during his time in Rome, Epaphroditus became sick, which delayed his return home and therefore the delivery of this letter. Now, the church in Philippi was started by Paul during his second missionary journey. He was accompanied by Silas and Timothy, and with the founding of the church in Philippi, Christianity made its first appearance in Europe since Philippi was in Macedonia. Paul considered the starting of this church as significant, seen by him calling the establishment of this church as the beginning of the gospel. The first convert in Philippi was Lydia of Thyatira. She plays a very important role not only in Macedonian social life, but also in the church at Philippi. Paul's ministry in Philippi was marked by conflict and persecution. He was mistreated there and suffered abuse. For example, he was dragged into the marketplace, falsely accused of crimes, publicly beaten with rods, and jailed with his feet in chains. After spending some time in jail, Paul brought a jailer to faith along with other people and eventually left for Thessalonica. After Paul left Philippi, he continued to have a relationship with the church. He most likely left behind one of his associates, possibly Luke, to keep contact with the church in Philippi, as suggested by Paul's use of "we" when he visited Philippi later. Besides Luke, we know that Timothy was another person who visited Philippi to inform Paul of what was going on in the church. We know that Timothy played a role in starting the church, probably traveled through that city on his way to Corinth, as evidenced by Paul mentioning Timothy in the opening of this letter, and that he intends on sending Timothy to Philippi again in the future. By his own account, Paul had a special relationship with the church in Philippi. Departing from his usual practice of refusing compensation from the churches he started, Paul accepted financial support from the church while he was in Thessalonica. Money was also given to him by the Philippians later when he was in Corinth. This is an interesting fact considering that the Philippians were living in poverty, as were others in Macedonia. So Paul did not accept monetary gifts from the Philippians because of their wealth, but he did so because of their genuine affection and care for him. The fact that Paul did not accept any money from the wealthier Corinthians shows the difference between his relationship with that church versus the Philippians. It also shows the difference in maturity between the Corinthians and the Philippians, especially since he mentions that he had every right to receive financial compensation, but purposely does not receive it from the Corinthians. Thus, Paul's willingness to receive multiple financial gifts from the Philippians shows how close he was with that church and the maturity of the congregation of Philippi to not accuse Paul of serving God for money. Let me go over the structure of this book. Paul opens with his typical greetings, then begins to praise God. He discusses how his imprisonment has such a positive impact for God's kingdom. Then Paul encourages the church to live with humility by quoting a famous hymn that speaks about Christ's humility as evidenced in his incarnation. Then Paul goes over his plans to send Timothy and Epaphroditus to Philippi soon, and then he warns the Philippians about false teachers who would hinder their spiritual growth. And finally, he concludes with an expression of his gratitude for the financial gift that they gave to him. So when looking at the letter, there's one common thread that Paul uses to sew all the topics together: joy. The The word joy is repeated throughout this letter 14 times. In the rest of Paul's letter, he uses the word joy 36 times, or about an average of 0.5 times per chapter, while in this letter, he mentions it over 3 times per chapter. So why is Paul writing so much about joy? Because of his gratitude towards this congregation and his thanksgiving to God for their partnership. And the main topic Paul camps on to express his joy is by pointing to Jesus. He teaches them to live in harmony through humility by modeling after Jesus. Paul wrote that he poured out his life as an offering for the sake of Jesus. He encourages the Philippians to find their contentment in serving Jesus. So Paul's letter to the Philippians shows that joy comes from centering one's life on Christ. No wonder there are so many well-known passages from this letter. For example, when expressing his gratitude towards God, Paul writes this to encourage the Philippians. "And I am sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ." When talking about his imprisonment and other trials he experienced because of his witness of Christ, Paul writes this, "For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." Finally, when talking about how he was able to be content and endure trials, Paul writes this, "I can do all things through him who strengthens me." Thank you to today's sponsor, On Reverence. They offer a free digital worship music app called Maskill. If you want to find out more, I'll leave some links below in the description box. If you missed the last video about the book of Ephesians, I'll leave a link here for you to watch. And until next time, see you.